Yes. There are 3 more seats in here. 4 more. You people who are afraid to take the front rows. This isn't church, you know. You can sit up in front. Yes. I will try the more formal approach tonight. Good evening. My name is Bill Newland, and this is Parastudy, for some of you who don't know already. Parastudy is here to provide the environment where such speakers as Dr. Dan Fry may come to discuss with us just about any subject we can think of, including flying saucers. I think I will save the announcements until later. Dr. Fry, I think probably can tell us about himself. This is the first time I've met him, and we have a very high personal recommendation of him. And we'll just turn the meeting over to Dr. Fry.
I'm not very good at speaking about myself. I have worked in the rocket field almost as long as it's been a field in the United States. I was the first treasurer of the Pacific Rocket Society in the United States, which built and flew its own rockets sometime before the government ever got the idea of building them themselves. I have worked with one or more branches of government rocket development ever since the very first military rockets were tested at the California Institute of Technology plant in back of Pasadena. I worked there first, then when that project was completed at the close of World War II, I worked for Aerojet Engineering Corporation for about 6 years, and then set up with Edwin Sawyer a company of our own. This has very little to do with the subject that I'm speaking on tonight, except it was through the interest in rocketry and the place where it is leading us that I came to learn a little something about the objects which are frequently and sometimes laughingly referred to as flying saucers. The government agencies which investigate these reports refer to them as UFO, or unidentified flying objects. It is a subject about which there has been a great deal of ridicule, there has been a great deal of misunderstanding, and of that there still is a more than ample supply. It's my purpose tonight to try to bring a little bit of common, simple understanding to the subject. I always try to do this without asking anyone to take anything on my authority. Whenever I lecture on the subject of extraterrestrial life and intelligence, and when time permits after the lecture for an indefinite question period, there are always about 100 questions which are asked by each audience in just about the same order and in just about the same way. It has been my experience that these first 100 questions can be answered by the audience just as well as they can by me, although the audience asks them each time. And I find it is much more satisfactory if they do answer those questions for themselves, because then they don't have to take my authority for anything, and all I have to do is remind them of a few things that they have long known to enable them to answer those questions for themselves. In the first place, however, there are a few questions, basic questions that come up that perhaps need a little statement on. Those statements have been made in public and by some of the best-known astronomers in the world today. When an object which does not seem to answer to any earthly description is observed by numbers of people, or is observed by a person well enough known so that his story is accepted, the questions begin. For instance, if we assume that this could be an object from someplace other than this earth, from whence does it come? So usually the first question that is asked on this subject is, where do they come from? The question can't possibly be answered simply when asked in that way, because the person asking the question in that way is thinking that there must be one source of extraterrestrial life and intelligence. The best answer to that is some of the lectures that have been given by prominent astronomers in the last year. One of the most startling was given by Harlow Shapley, who of course has been the head of the Harvard Observatory for many years and a professor of astronomy at Harvard College. He has for quite some years now maintained that extraterrestrial life and intelligence is statistically certain. In his lectures, he does not say it is possible, he does not say it is probable, he said it is certain. I have, I believe, among these clippings, a short clipping of one of his lectures. I had the clipping of the latest one, but somehow it didn't get filed in this group. That's taken long. However, I can give it to you. I guess I didn't get it out. I got all of the others up, and I have it in here. Which he says, it's an argument which he points out that it is statistically certain. That lecture was given several years ago, but a few months ago he gave a further lecture in the West Coast, which was carried by the wire services and was largely reprinted in newspapers throughout the West Coast. In this, he went a little farther than he has ever gone before. And the editor of the Medford Tribune, Cleveland Twitchell, who happens to be a good friend of mine, reprinted the lecture in the Medford Tribune. Then he clipped out the item from the paper and mailed it to me with a footnote under, "Doesn't this sound familiar?" Well, it did sound familiar because it was a carbon copy of a lecture that I've been delivering for about 7 years. Almost word for word through the complete lecture. However, this was not, don't think for a minute that this was plagiarism of my lecture's reputation. I don't know whether Harlow Shafley has ever heard one of my lectures or not. They have been taped on several hundred occasions, and he could well have, but his lecture would have been exactly the same whether he had or not, because this lecture is merely one that makes use of existing and well-accepted data that's available to everyone and applies to it mathematics. So that anyone who takes the same data and applies mathematics to it will inevitably come out with the same conclusion. No matter how many people multiply 2 by 2, if the multiplication is correct, they will all get the same answer. The only remarkable thing about the lecture is the lengths to which it went and the fact that he dared to give it. It was a very encouraging sign, because he started with a statement that the only way we can really examine this question is statistically. And while people may argue that statistics do not prove anything in any one case, they become a very precise science when there are enough cases involved. It is the science that enables insurance companies to predict within 1%, sometimes 0.5% of how many policies they will have to pay off in the coming year, even though they haven't the faintest idea which ones they will be. It is also the science that enables nuclear physicists to predict the half-life of an element accurately to 6 decimal places, even though they haven't the faintest idea when the next atom is going to fission. So he said this is the only system, really scientific system, we can apply, but we do have enough individual items to make it quite a precise science. But to be sure that we are conservative in every one of the steps that we are going to take, where there is any controversy over the relative figures, we will in every case choose the most pessimistic of all known estimates. So we are going to consider extraterrestrial life and intelligence in this galaxy, not in the universe, just in our own star cluster, which we call the Milky Way. There are about 10 billion of such galaxies known to astronomers today. We're only going to consider one of these 10 billion. That is our own cluster, which we call the Milky Way, and it contains a little more than 100 billion stars. Very much like our sun, most of them. Some of them are somewhat larger. Our sun is just a common, ordinary garden variety of star. And we have in this galaxy a little more than 100 billion of these stars. Now the first question which arises is, on what percentage of these stars will there be conditions, or what percentage of these stars will have planets? He said, let's start at the beginning. What percentage of these stars will have planets? Because in our tremendous attempt, sponsored by our egos, to remain unique in the universe, we had taken many desperate steps. A few decades ago, when we began to become aware of the number of stars in the universe, we resorted to the creation of the tidal wave theory of the formation of the planets. We said that possibly or probably the planets were formed by the close approach to our sun of another star, another similar star. And that the gravitational forces involved became so strong that they pulled out tremendous quantities of gas from the sun and sent these whirling into orbit about the sun, where they subsequently cooled down, solidified, and became planets. This was a theory that has never been compatible with any laws of celestial mechanics that we know. It has never been capable of answering the questions that arose about it. But it was accepted by very many people for decades because it allowed us to remain unique in the universe. If our solar system was created by such a rare cosmic accident, there might not be more than one or two other solar systems in the whole galaxy. It was the last despairing gasp of egos which have been fighting knowledge ever since it began to percolate through the darkness of ignorance. The ego is the greatest barrier to human learning. It always has been. At the beginning, when we began to consider the universe about us, we naturally assumed that everything revolved about our Earth, that it was the center of the universe. It seemed quite natural to suppose that. We said the sun and the moon and all of the stars revolve every day about the Earth. It was an easy theory to accept because we could see them doing it, apparently. But then we had a few men whose interest was a little bit above their egos and who were fair enough with themselves to submerge their own egos, and they began to make little measurements of these movements, and they began to wonder. One, as you remember, finally postulated that he didn't believe that the sun went around the Earth at all. He thought the Earth went around the sun. Well, of course, at the time, this was such rank heresy that an indignant populace almost executed him on the spot. He was persecuted, he was threatened with death, and he was forced to recant publicly this heresy, which he obligingly did. But if you remember reading the history, he was heard to state to his close companions, nevertheless, the Earth does go around the sun. But sooner or later, we have to take a back seat a little bit at a time. We finally grudgingly accepted the fact that the Earth went around the sun rather than vice versa. Then our ego took another blow when we found the sun was not the center of the universe either, that it was one of 100 billion or more stars, and just an ordinary one. And then it took still another blow when we discovered that some of these individual stars that we had seen outside of the galaxy were not really stars at all. There were other galaxies similar to our own, being so far away that they looked as though they were only one star. And so in desperation, we created the tidal theory to attempt to remain unique. That tidal theory has gone down the drain. It was never able to answer the questions which it raised. It was never compatible with laws of celestial mechanics. And besides, we see too many galaxies today. We see them in all stages of formation. We see some very new ones. We see some that are a little bit older. And we see some that are very old. And so another theory goes down the drain, the theory of abelimetry a few decades ago, that it's now known colloquially as the Big Bang theory. That is, that the universe was created in a 30-minute period of coherent time that was sandwiched between two eternities. Now, that was always a difficult philosophical concept. It's hard enough to imagine one eternity. But when you have to imagine two eternities, and then you have to sandwich those two eternities between 30 minutes of coherent time, it becomes very difficult. This is exactly what the Big Bang theory said. It said that there was a tremendous mass of matter that contained all of the matter in the universe in one tremendous lump. All the millions of billions of stars that we know of, some 1 million times larger than our sun, which is about 1 million times larger than our Earth. All this was in one lump, where it had been forever and ever and ever. There could be no consideration of how it got there, and if anyone assumed that it had not been in that same condition forever, then you had to explain where it came from or how it got to be there or what happened before that, and this was too difficult. So the theory just said that big ball of matter had been there forever and ever and ever. perfectly quiescent, nothing had happened to it, it was unchanging forever and ever and ever, and suddenly it exploded. No reason was ever attempted as to why it should explode, after having been quiescent for all eternity. But it did. It suddenly exploded, hurling the various portions in all directions, which subsequently became the galaxies, and imparting to them the motion which we still observe, that they are all expanding, going away from us in all directions, and that they will continue to do so forever and ever and ever and ever. So you see, we have an eternity reaching into the past, eternity reaching into the future, and the whole thing is sandwiched between 30 minutes of time during which all the actual change took place, and that we happen to be right in the middle of it. Our little Earth, again, is right in the center of this explosion, because it wouldn't look the way it does to us if it wasn't in the middle for any part other than the middle of this explosion. So it has gone down the drain. It's now, we see galaxies in all stages of formation. But the ego still battles to remain unique. We have had evidence of the existence of extraterrestrial life and intelligence for as far back as the history of this planet goes. We have always managed to escape as a race. There have always been a few people who knew. As a race, we have managed to escape. But Shapley pointed this out. He said, let us consider how many such life forms there would be in a galaxy such as ours. How many of these stars have planets? And he pointed out that it is now generally accepted that most of them will. The planets are not a cosmic accident. They are a perfectly normal accompaniment to the condensation of a star. That they come from the same material that condenses to form the star. And he gave in his lecture a diagram showing how the gaseous material condensing to form the star first creates a vortex, and it always does. And the vortex increases in speed as the condensation goes on until a point is reached where the material at the exterior portion of the vortex achieves approximately escape velocity with respect to that condensation. So there's no tendency for it to fall inward. It tends to condense linearly around the periphery of rotation. And so the planetary system is predictable and quite normal. He said there is some difference of opinion as to the exact percentage of stars that will have planets. Some astronomers say, well, practically all of them will. Some astronomers point out that some stars are binaries, that is, two stars of roughly the same mass rotate about a common center of gravity, and because the eccentric rotation produced might sweep up this extraneous material and prevent planets from forming. The minimum estimate today is about 1 in 10. The most pessimistic estimate says, well, maybe there are only one planet, one star in 10 most planets. So Dr. Shapley said, we'll accept cheerfully the most pessimistic estimate and say that 1 in 10 has planets. On the question of how many planets they will have on the average, there is no controversy. That comes out 10. That the average planet, if a star if it has planets at all, will have an average of 10 planets. We know of 9 here as an example, and we have quite obviously a 10th which we had at one time, which for some reason or other came to pieces and is scattered around its orbit. And we call it the asteroid belt, but the laws of celestial mechanics predict there should be a planet there, and they predict the mass that planet should have. And if you total up all of the material in the asteroid belt, it averages up very nicely into the size of the planet that should be there. So we have 10, or did have 10 originally. And the estimate today is that this will be the average number of planets that a star will have. So if one star in 10 has planets, and that star has 10 planets, you see that we have approximately the same number of planets in this galaxy that we have stars, or about 100 billion. The next question is, what percentage of those planets will have conditions suitable for life as we know life? And he pointed out that that was a very tiny segment of the total spectrum of possibility, life as we know it. That this is just taking one tiny little view thing. But he said, we'll take this tiny little view because it's the one thing we know about. What percentage of planets would have conditions suitable for the development of this kind of life, based on the carbon atom and the protein molecule? And there is some controversy. If we judge from our own solar system, we have 3 here, which could quite possibly produce such life. That is almost 1/3 of the number we have. But there are some stars which wax and wane in intensity, that give off more energy at one time and a good deal less at another, and this might make it pretty rough for life to develop on such a planet. So he has eliminated those. We have some that are considered to be too dull. The red giants are considered not to give off concentrated enough energy. Although they might well do so if the planets were close in orbit, close to the sun. But again, there are a range of estimates, and the most pessimistic estimate said maybe only 1 in 100 has conditions suitable for life as we know it. So Schaeffler said, in order to be perfectly safe, we'll accept that most pessimistic estimate. We'll say only 1 in 100 has conditions suitable for life. This leaves us 1 billion planets with conditions suitable for life. The next question that arises is on what percentage of those planets that have conditions suitable for life will life actually have developed? And again, there is some controversy. Some biologists say it will develop on every planet, sooner or later, on every planet that has conditions suitable for it. That it's a statistical certainty. Some biochemists will point out that the chemical reaction which produces amino acid from which life is supposed to stem on this planet is a very delicate one, that it requires a very precise combination or presence of oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, and probably an electric discharge, which would only come through lightning in nature usually. And so it wouldn't be too likely to happen at any one given place at any one given time. But astronomers point out that a planet has tens of millions of square miles of surface, and on every square mile of this surface, tens of thousands of random chemical reactions are taking place every minute. And that any planet which has conditions suitable for life at all will retain those conditions suitable for life for at least 2 billion years. For at least 2,000 millions of years. So the biologist says, statistically, it'll happen sooner or later on every planet on which it can possibly happen. This is assuming only the random chance or pure chance method. If we assume a divine plan, there's no reason why a planet should be made suitable for life without life being put on. So we reach the same conclusion in any case. The remarkable thing about the pure chance approach and the divine plan approach is that in practically every case they come out identical. The results come out identical. You reach the same conclusion by whichever route you go. So he said, we will take the most pessimistic of all estimates and say that it happens on only 1 in 10. Most biologists say it will happen on all of them. Let's say it happens on only 1 out of 10. This leaves us 100 million planets that actually have life. This leaves only one more question on what percentage of those planets would that life have passed the state of development, intelligence, and achievement that we have reached here. And if we had nothing but pure statistics to use here, we would have to say, well, probably half of it is behind us yet and half of it is ahead. But we have another factor to consider here, and that is the point which we occupy in the galaxy. Because it has been observed now, we've been studying galaxies in all stages of formation, it has been observed that the stars appear first in the central portions of the galaxy. That a galaxy results from the condensation of a dark nebula, as we call it, from tremendous accumulation of gas between existing galaxies. It is mostly gas emitted by the galaxy surrounding it. The sun is hurling forth tremendous quantities of hydrogen atoms at all times. That is, on the surface, hydrogen atoms achieve escape velocity from the surface of the sun. They're hurled outward. The Earth intercepts a tremendous quantity of them. It's one of the things that produces the ionized layer there above the Earth. But of course, many of them escape from the solar system completely, escape from the galaxy completely, and when they do, they keep right on going. They begin to accumulate in the large spaces between galaxies. And eventually, the matter becomes dense enough so that a secondary condensation will begin to form. I don't want to be too technical or dwell too long, but there will be always are some people are interested. You can create a miniature galaxy. You can see every stage of formation of a miniature galaxy in a Wilson cloud chamber in about 2/5 of a second. If you evacuate it partially, put a small steam jet with a very fast-acting solenoid valve so you can squirt just a little bit of jet of live steam out of that jet into the Wilson cloud chamber, which is just a glass box, actually. It can be partially evacuated. And if you have a fast-act camera, real good lighting, real good magnifying devices, you can see this jet of steam come out. It'll start whirling into a vortex. It'll make about 2 revolutions, and then it'll begin to throw out spiral arms. It'll begin to condense, and about 1/5 of a second after the jet has come out, if you have large enough magnification, you can see that there are billions of tiny droplets of water formed. And if your magnification is good enough, you can see that every one of those little droplets is whirling. But the action that condenses those produces a vortex. They produce in vortex, a condensing vortex action, which has the drop spinning. Every one of those little drops of condenser spinning. They make a perfect duplicate of a galaxy. It takes about 2/5 of a second. It takes about 15 to 20 billion years for nature to do it. But if you multiply the difference in size between the one you produce and the real galaxy, it comes out about the same. The ratio is about the same. But the whole point that I'm making at this great long length here is that the matter becomes densest in the center, and condensation, rapid condensation, starts in the center. Stars appear first in the center. That there's an estimated period of about 2 million years between the time the stars appear in the center of a galaxy and the time they begin to appear on the periphery. So the question arises, what part of the galaxy do we occupy? We said at first we were the center of the universe. We ought to at least be the center of the galaxy. And of course, our ego takes another tremendous blow when we find we're almost on the extreme outer edge. We're located in one of the spiral wings that's thrown out from the periphery of the galaxy. And that we are definitely Johnny-come-latelys in this galaxy, probably one of the last planets that was formed in the condensation of the galaxy. And that there were tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of planets with conditions suitable for life that were formed in the center of the galaxy several millions of years before. So, after having reached this point in his lecture, the astronomer pointed out that there is one fact that becomes evident beyond all escape. There's only one conclusion we can draw. That is that there certainly were, in the central portion of this galaxy, at least 10,000 planets which had on them intelligent life, which intelligent life achieved the ability to and did begin to travel in space at least 2 million years ago. At least 10,000 planets began traveling in space at least 2 million years ago in this galaxy. Now, the question then arises, how many spaceships would 10,000 planets build in 2 million years? And he said, we can create a mathematical figure. We have means by which we can approach this mathematically. It's such a large power of 10 that it doesn't mean anything to the mind. I mean, the mind can't begin to grasp it. He said it might help just a little bit in attempting to grasp it. If we stop for a moment to realize that it's only been about 60 years since Orville and Wilbur Wright managed to coax their first motorized box kite a couple of hundred feet off the ground at Kitty Hawk, New Jersey. 60 years. Today you can go to any major airport on Earth, and there are hundreds of them, and you will see tremendous planes laden with upward of 100 passengers taking off for foreign ports every 2 minutes of the day, right around the clock, 24 hours a day, 2 minutes apart, at every major airport. And there are hundreds of these on Earth. 60 years after it was barely proven to be possible And he said, we're not talking about 60 years here. We're not talking about 600 years, which is 10 times that much. We're not talking about 6,000 years, which is 10 times that much, or 60,000, which is 10 times that much, or 600,000, which is 10 times that much. We're talking about 2 million years. How many spaceships would be built by 10,000 planets? We're not talking about one planet either. By 10,000 planets that began 2 million years ago, by several 100,000 that have begun since then. Because if they began 2 million years ago, every decade, some other planets would reach that same stage, that same knowledge. And how many would there be? So we can create a figure. It's something we can work with. We can divide it by the number of cubic light years in the galaxy, estimate the number of miles traveled, and we can reach the cross-sectional density. Now, we do this in nuclear physics to determine how many neutrons will pass a given point in a given length of time. And he said we can apply exactly the same mathematics to this to determine how many spaceships will pass any given point in any given period of time. And he said we reach another conclusion. That is that this planet Earth has been given at least a close pass-by, a close look-in, if not a landing, at the very least 10,000 times since the birth of Christ. At least 10,000. And that this would be true no matter where this planet were situated in the periphery of this galaxy, that is, at the approximate point where it is. This would be true of every planet located on the periphery of the galaxy. That you don't have to require anything special of the Earth to do it. That that's just a random pass-by of that number of ships in that length of time. Well, it comes out fairly close to the number of actual documented sightings of these things that there are. There are about 10,000 actual documented sightings since the birth of Christ. I'm not speaking about just the latest flap. There have been 8,000 in the last 10 years reported. That is 8,000 objects reported. Probably by no means all of these were spaceships. Probably not more than 1 or 2% actually represented extraterrestrial devices. But there have been about, since birth of Christ, there have been about 10,000 throughout the world in all languages. There have been about 10,000 documented sightings of things that couldn't very well have been anything else. So those figures agree fairly well, but Shavely said, now this is a tremendous blow to the ego. But there are only two things we can do. We can accept it, or we can reject it. But if we reject it, we have to reject with it all of the logic, all of the knowledge, all of the intelligence, and all of the science which we possess. We have to throw it all away with it. Because if we want to save any of that, it predicts that this is inevitably true. He said there is one other solution. We can just try to forget all about it, just pay no attention to the fact. But if we think about it at all, we have to either accept it or we have to reject all of our science along with it. So the question of where do they come from becomes a little more understandable. As a final parting statement, the astronomer said, even assuming 10,000 approaches by extraterrestrial devices to the planet Earth in that time, it would still be statistically improbable that any two of them had come from the same place. So the 10,000, because the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of places from which they could have come, and only 10,000 actually passed our point, it was statistically improbable that any two of them had come from the same point. Now, this would be true if they were all random flights. I mean, if there was some pattern of development, some purpose for which those ships came especially, then they might, any number of them might come from the same point. But if it were just a random pass-by, that there are so many forms of life that are statistically certain in the galaxy that out of 10,000, you wouldn't be likely to get any two from the same point, the same location. So if someone sees an object in the skies which can't be explained as an airplane or an easy earthly explanation over this country, and 3 months later one is seen over Australia, and the two descriptions don't tally, exactly. Some people say, well, one or the other has to be wrong, because obviously if we're extraterrestrial visitors that all look exactly alike, the ships would all be exactly alike, they'd all come from the same place and all for the same purpose. We are in the middle of a galaxy which is literally teeming with life of every conceivable description, and probably tens of thousands of varieties of life that we can't conceive of at all. Possibly varieties of life that we wouldn't recognize as life if we saw it. And possibly types of intelligence that we couldn't recognize. There is a probability that carbon life, protein life, would ultimately result in the same final product. It's something that I discussed with an anthropologist some years ago. I was lecturing in Los Angeles, and he came up after the talk and introduced himself to me, and we began to walk over across the street from the auditorium to have some coffee. And he said, Mr. Fry, I have no doubt whatever that there are any number of types of life in this galaxy, and I have no doubt whatever that a great number of them have a high degree of intelligence, probably more intelligence than we. I just can't believe that any of them could possibly look anything like us. And I said, well, why? Why can't you assume that some of it might look like us? And he said, well, Earth man is solely the product of his environment. He is as he is only because the Earth is as it is. And if there were even the slightest difference in environment, it would result in a totally different product. So it just happened that as he was saying that, we were crossing the street, crossing the sidewalk, and a small red ant crawled out of a crack in the sidewalk. And I pointed the ant out to him, and I said, does that ant look like me? And he looked at it without thinking much and grinned. He says, no, I don't seem to recognize any great resemblance. I said, well, you should. I said, we're both products of identical environment. We're created right here on this planet. That if your theory holds, all life on this planet should be identical. How is it there's so much difference between two forms of it? Well, that struck him almost like a blow. He stopped dead still on the street there, and he thought, and he scratched his head, and he thought. Stood there for about a minute, and he says, well, I finally said, I see what you mean, Mr. Fry. He said, it's true that we have tens of thousands, in fact, several hundreds of thousands of varieties of life right on this planet. Nature apparently has tried every conceivable form in which it can put protoplasm molecules together. There's only one of them that seems to be suitable to house intelligence. And it's quite possible that the same process would be followed on any planet where conditions were sufficiently similar to those here that it could happen at all. And I said, yes, this is true. We say that this type of life is restricted to fairly rigorous temperature limits. At first, it seems that it couldn't exist below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, because so much of the body is water, and if you were below freezing, the water would freeze up and the person would become immobile. And it couldn't exist above 212 degrees, because then the water would boil and the object would be destroyed. But at least on one end, this is proven to be not true. We do have, beyond the Arctic Circle, very hardy races of Eskimo who live in regions where the temperature seldom gets up as high as freezing. It's below freezing practically all the time. And they still manage to lead a very successful life. So we don't know just what limits there are to this type of life. But within all of the limits that we find on this planet, we find that the product is the same. Those Eskimos who are living at a temperature practically always below freezing. All have 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, 2 arms, 2 legs. They have 10 fingers. They have 10 toes. They're surprisingly similar to the beings who develop in the tropical zones where the temperature is around 100 degrees almost all the time. So the theory that even a very small change in environment would create an entirely different product falls by the wayside. So that there is a strong probability that on planets where conditions are suitable for a protoplasm life, that the final end product would be very much the same on all of them. If we again accept the divine principle of life, then we would reach the same conclusion. Say, why should the end product be different on different planets if it were created by design? So again, in either case, we reach the probable conclusion that a great number of planets will have forms of life very similar to ours. Some of them perhaps so similar that you wouldn't be able to recognize the difference if you were to see them. When we have accepted or realized the number of sources of life, then we begin to realize that some of it has visited us, is visiting us, and probably will continue to visit us. Then about 100 questions arise. They are the kindergarten questions, but almost everyone asks them first. Of course, everyone goes to kindergarten before he goes to the higher grades, or should. There is a short analogy which I am going to give without further ado. I concocted this analogy solely for the purpose of answering those questions without having to go through them one at a time at a period of some 3 or 4 hours' time. And as I say, because of the fact that the listener can answer the questions for himself, it's much more satisfactory than he isn't taking anything on my say-so. But there are questions then arise, such as why don't they land on the White House lawn? Why don't they ask for radio communication? Why don't they land in our Chamber of Commerce and get some trade pacts going? Or why don't they just land and conquer us and make us slaves and take whatever they want? All these questions are asked by everyone when he first approaches the subject, until we realize that there are on this planet at least 2 areas, one in central Australia and one in central Brazil, where there are races of human beings that have not yet achieved the bow and arrow. They still depend on the stone axe and the spear. There are many races in those areas that haven't gone beyond that. There are many in Africa, too, that haven't gone beyond the bow and arrow. But there are several of these races that haven't reached the bow and arrow yet. They are at least 20,000 years behind us in scientific development, even though they are now within 8 hours by jet from some of our foremost centers of civilization. It's a rather remarkable paradox that you can have a human race 8 hours away that's 20,000 years behind you. But they are. They have no written language, they have no rapid means of communication, and they know nothing whatever about us. We know a little bit about them. Some of our explorers have penetrated very briefly to the outskirts of those tribes, enough to know that they exist. We even know a few words of their language, but they have not conversed with us as a race. They have no way of keeping that knowledge going, and as a race, they know nothing at all about us. But we do have jet aircraft that occasionally fly over the areas in which they live and must occasionally be seen by those people, and must raise quite a controversy over what these things are, because they don't have the bow and arrow yet. We can imagine the first occasion when this happens. Perhaps one of these natives has pursued a wounded antelope out into the plains from the jungle in which they live. And while out there in the open plain, a multi-engine jet roars overhead at fairly low level. When that native's knees will work again, he begins to rush back to his people and gets there all out of breath, and he says, "Oh, the most terrible, the most wonderful thing happened to me today. You'll never believe it." And he will be quite right. He says a tremendous bird flew overhead. We never saw anything like it. Well, this bird had a wingtips. Well, the wing spread, it must have been 100 feet from tip to tip. And it didn't flap its wings. It held the wings outstretched all the time. It seemed to be able to fly without flapping its wings. And it wasn't the color of any other bird we've ever seen. It all seemed to be silver colored. The sun just shone off over it like it was all metal. And it made such a tremendous thundering sound that it shook the ground when it went overhead. and a long stream of black smoke was coming from its tail. About that time, his friends would say, "Look, Joe, why don't you go back to your hut and sleep it off? What are you bothering us with all this nonsense for? How silly can you get? We're willing to go along with a joke, but this is carrying a thing too far. Why, everyone knows that the biggest birds in the country are the condors, and some of them have wing spreads that are 7 feet from tip to tip, and once in a while a real big one will have a 9-foot wing spread. But when you talk about 100-foot wing spread, you're getting a little bit too far out. I mean, that's nonsense. And who ever heard of a bird that didn't flap its wings even occasionally? And we know that birds have various colors down here, but we don't have any all-silver birds. And while they make squawking noises and shrill screams once in a while, none of them create a thunder that shakes the ground. And even if we could manage to swallow all of this baloney, what is all this about black smoke coming from its tail? No, you better go back to your tent and sleep it off a while. And when you reach sanity again, when you get back to sanity, well then come and talk to us again. So it would be completely dismissed. No further thought would be given to it, but perhaps a few days later another native might come in looking kind of sheepish and say, "Well, boys, it looks like I've joined the crackpot crew because I think I've seen one of these things too." Well, if this happened often enough, eventually it would come to be accepted that there probably was something there. Because as more and more people saw them, the rest would say, "Well, gee, I don't know, they can't all be crazy. How could all these people be crazy? They can't all be pulling our legs. They all seem to know what they're talking about, and they all insist that they've really seen it. Maybe there really is something up there." Then the question would arise as to what it was. And at that point, perhaps one of the natives might suggest that it might be a machine. Now, this would be a very difficult suggestion to make. They don't have any word for machine in their language because they don't have any machines. They haven't even produced a bow and arrow yet. But he might be able to get over to his fellows the idea that perhaps somewhere in this planet there were human beings like themselves who might perhaps have progressed so far beyond them in science and in advancement that they might actually be able to build things in which they could fly. Well, his friends would say, "Gee, I don't know, it really sounds real far out. I don't know whether we can accept any possibility like that or not. But even if we could, it isn't logical. It isn't logical because they don't do the things they would do. They don't act right. It's very obvious that if there were a person like ourselves, a human being, in that thing that's going overhead, and they were piloting it, as they went overhead, they would look down and they would see us down here, and of course they would immediately land their ship. And they would rush up to us and they would say, "Take me to your witch doctor, or take me to your chief. We want to enter into commerce and trade. We want to get some trade pacts going here. We want to get some bones for our nose like you people have, and some copper to hang around our neck, and some of those luscious fried grub worms that you have for lunch." Well, we don't do it. Our pilots don't do it. They may look down and see them, they may be interested, but we don't wear bones in our nose anymore. We don't wear copper around our neck, and if we want to have any of those luscious fried grub worms for lunch, we can go down to the exotic food section in their supermarket. We can find them in 4-ounce cans already covered with chocolate. So we don't land. But at that point, another native will say, "Well, no, that isn't quite logical either. We got to go one step farther. If that is a race like ourselves, and they see us here, and they have built things in which they can fly, obviously they must have weapons that are far superior to anything of which we could dream. So why should they trade with us? They just land, they'd conquer us, they'd make us slaves, and they'd take whatever they wanted. That's what they do, of course. That's the logical thing. If they don't do it, there can't be any intelligent beings in those ships. Well, we don't do that either. The theory is logical. We do have such weapons. We could land, we could conquer that tribe any morning between breakfast and lunch. But having done so, what good would it do us? We don't use any of the products that they produce. It would only be one more nation to which we would have to ship Lend-Lease every month. So they are not in the least danger of being conquered, nor are they in the least danger of us demanding a trade pact with them. Our pilots might go down close, they might look, they might be interested enough to circle around and examine the tribe a little bit. But there's only one type of event that would arouse interest to the point of landing. If we assume for a moment that, as an example, that one of these tribes were living a Shangri-La existence, if you remember the story, that is a village in the bottom of a very fertile canyon, but with steep walls, steep canyon walls. This was what Shangri-La was supposed to be. And a pilot went over and he saw this nice little village nestled down there in the bottom of the canyon. Being fairly high in the air, he could look 40 or 50 miles up this canyon at the same time, and he saw that there was a tremendous lake at the head of this canyon, impounded by a natural earthen dam, and that an earthquake had ruptured that dam, and that the waters of that lake were pouring out in an ever-increasing flood into the mouth of that canyon. He would immediately be in the position of a prophet with respect to that tribe. Now, he wouldn't need any crystal ball, he wouldn't need any fortune-telling cards, he wouldn't need any Ouija board. He's up high enough so he has access to data that they don't have. And he becomes a prophet because he can tell just about what's going to happen to that village and just about when it's going to happen, depending on how far away the lake is and how fast the water's coming. At that point, if he were a normal human being, even at our own very low state of present development, he would certainly feel some impulse to land and to warn those people of what was going to happen. Now, he might or he might not do it, depending on the individual, depending on how easy it was to land. But he would feel an impulse to do it. We do have such impulses, even in this state of development. We do send missionaries to these tribes. Usually they wind up in the stew pots very soon, but we keep on sending them. If you remember, 2 years ago, we sent 3 to this tribe in central Brazil. If you remember the newspapers, 2 of them were killed almost on sight, almost as soon as they appeared. The third one was wounded but managed to escape. He got back to civilization. They dispatched a little military contingent in there, and they corralled a few of these natives and asked them why they had killed these men that had only come out there to help. Well, they didn't have a very good answer. They said, well, they appeared suddenly. We didn't have any advance warning, and when they appeared, we thought we were being attacked, and we just sort of killed them before we thought much about it. Well, we still didn't take an atom bomb in there and wipe out that tribe. We didn't do anything to them. We just said, well, look, next time some of our people come, try to restrain yourself a little bit, at least until you find out what we're here for. So we do send missionaries. But this pilot, if he decided to make such an attempt, if he decided to try to warn these people, and if he were intelligent, he would know at once that there was no hope of success if he landed in the midst of that tribe. They would certainly feel they were being attacked. They would either all flee in all directions, leaving no one with whom he could talk, or if they were a little bolder, a little more aggressive, a little more warlike, they would immediately counterattack, and even with primitive weapons could probably succeed in killing him before he could make himself understood. In any event, he would have to fight, and you simply can't communicate with the person with whom you're fighting. So the effort would fail. There would be only one hope, and that would be to land at some little distance from this tribe, to attempt more or less casually to contact one or more individuals of that tribe and pass on to them the information that he had. If he succeeded in doing it, he would then go on his way. He had accomplished his purpose, he'd passed on the information, he had passed the buck, as it were, and his conscience would be clear, and he'd go on about his original errand. But he would leave this poor native in a terrible spot. Because if this native rushed back to his fellows and said, "Oh, folks, you know, these things we've been talking about, these things we've been seeing going overhead and been wondering whether they had people in them," well, they do. As I was out there today out on the plain, one of those things landed. And I started to run, but it didn't take after me or anything. And I looked back, and the hatch had opened, and a man came out, and he didn't look too dangerous, so I waited around a little bit, and he made motions to me, and we finally got together. And his skin was white, and he had a leather jacket on. He had wonderful clothes with metal buckles and all sorts of fancy things on him. His skin was white instead of dark like ours, but otherwise he looked much the same, and he even knew a few words of our language. How, I don't know, but he did, and by signs and these words he told me that there was a large lake up the head of this canyon that we're living in. Well, he wouldn't get that far. He might try, but he wouldn't even get that far. The instant that he said that thing landed and the superior being got out and talked to me, every eyebrow in the tribe would go up. And the people would say, "You, who are you? You're not the witch doctor. You're not the chief. Why should any superior being bother himself with you?" When the ego says that, and it always does say it, what the subconscious is thinking is it would have been me. When you say they'd only talk with the chief or the witch doctor, what the ego is saying, well, if they're going to talk to anybody, obviously it would be me. And if it wasn't me, then there must be something wrong with it. It can't be true. So every conceivable effort would be made to obstruct or to discount what that native had to say. They would constantly repeat, well, they'd talk to the witch doctor, the chief, or to somebody else. Who are you? Well, perhaps the pilot didn't have time to pass around Stanford Binet intelligence tests to all these natives, have them fill them out to see which one was the most highly developed, the most advanced, the most intelligent, and so entitled to receive his message. And perhaps the pilot didn't really believe that the witch doctor or the chief might know any more about the subject than anyone else. He was just looking for someone who could understand what he had to say. Having found such a person, he would say it and go on his way. Every effort would be made to prevent this information from being accepted. The ego would be working again. Nevertheless, if this contactee, we have to call him now, if he were very patient, very energetic, very logical, and kept everlastingly at it, he probably in the end would succeed in saving a few members of that tribe, at least the more intelligent ones. Because after a little while, the more intelligent ones would stop laughing for a minute, and they'd say, well, wait a minute, what's the price? What are they asking us? What are they suggesting we do? They're not asking that we give them $1 million, they're not asking we give anyone anything. They're just suggesting we get a little bit higher up on these walls so we understand a little more, we can see what's going on, and we'll be out of the way of this flood when it comes, if it comes. Well, this doesn't cost anything, and it isn't very hard to do, and if we do it and no flood comes, we can come back, we have everything we had before, we won't have lost anything. And if we get up there and the flood does come, we're still alive, so why not go along with the gag and do as the man suggests, because after all, it really doesn't cost anything. And it might be a real good idea. So he probably would succeed in saving some of them if he were very logical, very patient, very energetic, and if the lake was far enough away, he might be able to save all of them. But in any event, he would have to do what he could. If we move this analogy one order of magnitude forward, we can answer about 95 of the first 100 questions that are asked on the subject, and we don't have to take anyone's word for it all because we understand the situation now. There are a few other questions of this 100 that also need to be answered. When I do, I'm going to pause a minute here and perhaps get a sip of water, and then we will begin with the 10,000 questions that arise after the first 100 have been answered. But they're more interesting and more important. You need to get a foundation of this thing so you can picture the facts as they are, and then from there you can you can build intelligent knowledge and realization upon it. Almost any place that I speak, people will ask me why certain people who apparently are contactees were contactees. I'm thinking of one particularly named Truman Bethune. I don't know how much you know about Truman Bethune. I've known him for, well, since before he became known to the public at all as a contactee. But at that time, he had never gone beyond the 6th grade in elementary school. And perhaps 200 people in different parts of the country have asked me, sometimes rather sarcastically, why any superior being or intelligence would waste his time concerning himself with a person who hadn't gone beyond the 6th grade. In order to answer that, I have to refer momentarily to a term paper which I wrote in my junior year in high school. Now, this paper had nothing to do with metaphysics, had nothing to do with space travel. We were given a choice of 3 subjects, and the one I chose was cause and effect for a term paper. Now, I had never heard the word karma, I don't think, at that time. I knew nothing of metaphysics, but I did know about how the rest of the students would write on the subject of cause and effect. And I always wanted to be just a little bit different, so I started this term paper with the life story of a horsefly who was flying about in an alley behind a barn-like structure in a suburb of a city. And after flying around a little while, it observed that one of the doors was slightly ajar and decided to fly in and see what was inside. And at that point, I left the life of that horsefly. I went a few blocks across town, and I picked up the life of a city fireman who was just sitting down at the supper table and was discussing with his family the vacation trip that he was going to take next week. And after a few sentences, I left him with a statement that he little realized that he would be dead before morning, because that fly chose that particular moment to fly into that particular door. I then went across town a little ways and picked up the life of a real estate broker and builder and promoter who was also at the supper table discussing with his family the large new building which he proposed to erect alongside of an existing building on one of his properties. And I left him with a statement that he little realized that every building he owned would be destroyed before morning, because that fly chose that particular moment to fly into that particular door. Well, I went around town a few other places, just picked up people's lives very quickly, very casually, listened to a few of their plans, and left them with a statement of how those plans would be totally avoided or totally changed by the simple fact of that fly flying in that door. The explanation, of course, was a very simple one. The city was Chicago. The barn was Mother O'Leary's cow barn. The horsefly was the fly that bit the cow on the leg at the psychological moment, causing it to kick over the lantern, which produced the fire that destroyed about half the city of Chicago. It's an historical fact. We don't know for sure whether it started in Mother O'Leary's cow barn or not, but this is where it was supposed to start. It certainly started in a manner very similar to that. But having written this, I saw therein a moral, which doesn't too commonly happen to high school juniors, and I appended the moral as a postscript to the term paper. I said there appears to be a moral to this, and I think it's this, that as a race we seem to feel that those leaders or those people, those who are going to be of great value to us, our saviors as you might put it, who are going to be of great value to us as a race, must perforce be those of the highest degree of achievement. They must be those with the greatest intelligence, with the greatest training, with the greatest knowledge and wisdom, with the greatest spiritual attainment, and it isn't necessarily true at all. Because in this case, obviously, the most untrained, the simplest, most callow youth in town could have saved the city that night if he had been at the right place, at the right time, and had had a fly swatter. It's all the equipment he would have needed to save the city of Chicago. Well, when people ask me why people like Terminal Bathroom are contacted, I say maybe he's going to be at the right place at the right time with the fly swatter. Perhaps it's all he'll need. Perhaps it's all he'll need to save a city. Perhaps it's all he'll need to save a race. Perhaps it's all he'll need to save a planet. We have no way of knowing. If, for instance, tonight, tomorrow, or any night, Alan or any other being of a higher race should come to me and say, well, Mr. Fry, this is going to be a horsefly flying around behind Mother O'Leary's cow barn tonight at 7 o'clock in Chicago, and it's on 27th Street, the corner of H Avenue, and it might be a good idea to go down there and swat that fly. Well, I'd say fine. If you think it's a good idea, it's only 200 miles away. I think I can make it by then. Sure, I'll go down. I'll swat that fly. So I'd fill up the tank. I'd dash down there and get a fly swatter and I'd swat the dickens out of that fly. But having done so, I might feel a little frustrated, a little futile. And I think, well, gee, it doesn't look like I'm getting very far. Don't see that I've really helped this civilization out very much or helped anyone. True, the fly population has been diminished by 1, but I don't see that that's of any vital importance to civilization. And it was a pretty costly thing because I spent my last dollar to buy gas to get over there and I had to borrow the dime to buy the fly swatter from somebody else. So I just wonder whether the game is worth the candle. I would have no way of knowing that I had saved the city of Chicago, and certainly the city of Chicago would have no way of knowing it had been saved. It would be extremely unlikely that the city of Chicago would ever strike a medal in my honor because I had swatted a fly. But there is one thing that we can apply here that keeps most of those people going who don't receive any medals or don't expect to or even hope to receive medals. That is the knowledge of a certain physical law. We have laws in physics. They're called conservation laws. We have a law of conservation of matter, or the conservation of energy, the conservation of momentum. We also have a law of conservation in the social science that says that no effort for good is ever lost on this planet. Whether or not you pluck the fruit from the seed that you plant, it will grow, and no effort for good is ever lost. A man named Johnny Appleseed, went through the Pacific Northwest quite a lot of years ago, strewing apple seeds around. His name has become sort of a byword. There are legends about it. I happen to live in a portion of Oregon and happen to own quite a bit of ground there where some of these apple trees grew. And those apple trees are still there, and they still bear a full crop of apples every year. And as late as this fall, we had quite a number of very excellent, very delicious pieces of pie made from those apples. And Johnny Appleseed planted a long time ago. So no effort for good is ever lost. It's the thing we have to remember when we feel a little frustrated because we don't see the results. We're swatting flies and we can't see where this saves the city. But it does. I'm going to take a very brief break now and perhaps get a glass of water. You can be thinking up the other 10,000 questions and then we'll get to the interesting part of the meeting. I just wanted to create a little bit of foundation, a sort of basis of understanding on the subject as a whole, so we'll have a place to go on from. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're taking a brief break. I have a couple of announcements, several announcements. The Peace Pilgrim will be here December the 4th. She's going to speak, and the title of her talk will be The Mystic Need. We would like a few volunteers next Monday for collating the PR. You don't have to raise your hands, just please, a couple of you come next Monday, or half a dozen of you. Hugh Lynn Casey will be here November 23rd. and the 25th, and there are notices right here. Incidentally, here are some of the same newsletters from ARE.
No, those are about the weekend in New York.
Oh, excuse me. These are next weekend in New York City with Joan Graham, with the ARE Center in New York City. These Monday evenings are, of course, open to everyone without charge, but we would like at this time to give all of you an opportunity to contribute toward the expenses of the evening. I will pass the plate.
You sing too?
No, I don't sing. Did it run out? Excuse me. Start off. I have a sort of a question. It almost seems to me as if this idea that life on other planets must grow to look like us is maybe the last. Maybe it really is the last gasp of egotism.
Mm-hmm. Well, it may be. I personally have never suggested that it must grow to look like this. I've only pointed out that there isn't any real logical reason why it shouldn't. Why it shouldn't follow the same path. Now, this isn't exactly egotism because it doesn't state how far along we've got. I mean, whether or not we will change in appearance as we really reach true culture or not, I don't know. But I think that probably all life as it grows and develops, or a great deal of it, will go through essentially the same stages. We are at a very critical stage of development of ours right now, and other life in the galaxy looking like us wouldn't necessarily be a compliment to them. So we're not sure whether it's egotism to say they look like us or not. You know, there's the old story about the fellow came up to his friend on the street and he says, Joe said I looked like you. And his friend said, well, where is he? I'll hit him. And Joe says, too late, I've already killed him. So I don't know whether it's egotism or not to say that probably the rest of them look like us. They might not be flattered at all if we said that. But I'm speaking merely of a biological series of developments, and there is no obstacle in the way of thinking that this particular type of evolution, if we proceed from the evolution theory, that the same type of evolution shouldn't take place in any region where the same conditions exist. After all, the same chemical reactions will take place wherever you have the same chemicals and bring them together in the same way at the same temperature. The same reactions will take place, and there isn't any basic reason why the same type of biological development shouldn't take place. Now, don't let us think for a minute that we're anywhere near the top of this biological development. We're just in one stage of it. These beings that have been traveling in space for the last million years might not bear any resemblance to us at all now, even though they might have at one time. And we can't even begin to dream of the powers that they would have. This is another one of these thought blocks that keeps rising to pester people. These things sometimes are seen to execute maneuvers, to achieve velocities, to do things that we can't do yet, and we can't quite see how they could be done. It doesn't seem very possible to us, and so we say, well, that couldn't be real. They couldn't exist because now we can't do those things, and we can't figure how they could do it, so therefore they couldn't do it. But at the rate that we are progressing now, in about another 30 years, if we keep this civilization together at all, we will have achieved every power and every ability of which we can now conceive. And beyond that, we'll be dealing in areas that we can't even conceive of yet. we can tell this if we look into the past. One of the best ways of predicting the future is to look into the past. A few decades ago, there was a science fiction writer named Jules Verne who used the most fantastic concepts his mind was capable of generating as the basis of his stories. The most fantastic things he could conceive, he wrote as being fact, and was very roundly criticized and condemned by his contemporaries for his extreme voyages in a fantasy that could never even begin to approach fact. And of course, we know that we have passed all of the things of which he described, and many of them now old hat. And we think of the things that he talked about in fantasy as being obsolete concepts. We have achieved a number of things which he wasn't even able to conceive of at that time. But in the meantime, our rate of progress constantly accelerates. We've had as much development in the last 30 years as we had in the previous 100, and we had as much in that 100 as we had in the previous 1,000. This curve constantly turns upward. And if we extrapolate that into the future, it predicts that if we keep this civilization together at all, we will again pass the limit of human imagination within about 30 or 40 years. That if we can conceive of a power or an ability now, in that length of time we will have it. And in 10 years beyond that, we will have powers and abilities we can't even dream of now. We can't even think of them. We can't even visualize them. So if you give a race 100 years advantage over us, they very obviously would have powers that we couldn't dream of, couldn't conceive of. If you resurrected a person who passed away on this earth 100 years ago and tried to explain to him television, atomic energy, orbital devices, moonshots, things that we need and take for granted today, he couldn't understand any of them. They would all be pure magic. If you brought the simplest all-band radio receiver and set it on this table and turned it on and you got some music, a band playing or an orchestra playing, and you explained to this man that this was an orchestra playing in Australia. And that not only was the sound coming to us very soon after it was played, but so soon that because we are close to the speaker and because this music is being played in a large auditorium there, that we hear it here, actually, before the people in the back of the auditorium hear it in Australia. Because electric waves travel much, much faster than sound. The electronic waves get here, they're converted into sound, this speaker operates, and that wave gets to our ears. If we're standing close to the speaker, it gets to our ears before the same sound wave gets to the back of the auditorium in Australia. Well, you might or might not make him believe it. You might not ever get him to believe that that music was originating in Australia. But if you did get him to believe it, you could certainly never explain it. He'd say, well, it's magic. You don't try to explain it to me. We can just say it's magic and let it go at that. So obviously a race that has even 100 years, much less 1,000 years or 10,000 years or 100,000 years, even in 100 years, they would have abilities of which we couldn't even conceive. So we can't be particularly surprised or astounded, and we're being very stupid if we deny the existence or reality of a race just because it seems to be able to do things that we can't understand. Because it wouldn't have to be very far ahead of us in order to be able to do it. Yes?
Do you have a personal experience that you can relate to us?
Well, of course, I have had a personal experience. Problem of relating it is that to do any kind of justice to it at all, it takes a couple of hours. To just relate it in 2 or 3 or 5 minutes would make a complete fairy story that wouldn't satisfy anyone. It wouldn't convince anyone. It wouldn't be of any real value to anyone. It occurred at the White Sands Proving Grounds on the evening of the 4th of July in the year 1950. I was at White Sands Proving Grounds at the time. In fact, it was the only rocket proving grounds in the world at the time. Woomera in Australia hadn't been finished, and Cape Canaveral hadn't even been started yet at that time. And all of the large rockets that were tested in this hemisphere, at least, and quite a few of them that were built in Europe, came here for testing. I was working for Aerojet Engineering Corporation at the time. And I had been sent 2 White Sands Proving Grounds to set up instrumentation for testing a very large rocket motor. That is, it was very large at the time. In fact, it was the largest in the world at the time. It developed a 100,000-pound thrust. That sounds kind of silly now. We call that a big motor, but it was the biggest in the world at the time. We were real proud of it. But that's how I happened to be there. But I had the opportunity to observe the landing and the takeoff and a small portion of the interior of a device which was not designed or intended to carry passengers. It was a sampling device. It was basically, it was being used at that time to take samples of Earth's atmosphere at ground level from various isolated points on the surface of this planet. It was being operated by remote control from a much larger craft or ship or device, which was reportedly some 900 miles above the surface of the moon. But there was an intercommunicating device in that sampling device, through which communication was had in the English language and in the American idiom. The American idiom was a little stilted, except for one fact. It might have been the voice of any engineer or scientist on base. And that fact was that slang words were used, which of course engineers use too, but they were not always used in the same place or the same way. They were used completely interchangeably with other equivalent words. It was as though the person using them had not learned to distinguish between the words which we have formally accepted into our language and those which we have not yet formally accepted but continually used. They were used interchangeably and sometimes with rather strange sounding results. They always made complete intelligence. You could always tell exactly what was meant, but they were in the midst of a rather precise scientific statement. A glaring slang word would appear, and so on. It just didn't sound normal. It didn't sound the way we would use it. But it was this fact that brought home to me the number and types of possible life in this universe, and the fact that we have been doing an excellent job of escaping from that fact for as far back as the written history of this earth goes. Because there have been records of such approaches, such landings, such contacts in every written language on this planet, as far back as any of them go. And as a matter of fact, well into the legends that preceded all written history on this earth, and are still existing. These reports were made. There are 18 specific references in the Bible to the eyewitness observation of material objects in the air. And strangely enough, in most cases, the description tallies exactly with the description of one or more people who have seen them today and described them today or in the last few years without the faintest idea that there was any such description anywhere else. A complete book has been written on the subject. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called UFO in the Bible. It's written by M.K. Jessup, in which he took the statements made by observers in the last few years and opposite them put the equivalent statement taken directly from the Bible, so that you can see the remarkable resemblance. In many cases, the biblical statement is stilted. In some cases, it's incomplete, probably because those translating didn't realize the significance, didn't carry it out with sufficient completeness. You know, the Bible is taken from over 200 books. And the important excerpts were taken from the books, but they were not always taken with a degree of completeness that they should have been taken. If you take one of these cases, the story of Elijah and Elisha, it is pointed out that he was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire, accompanied by the whirlwind, and was seen no more on earth. The description is very brief and at first glance doesn't seem to mean too much until you begin to analyze it a little bit. But we notice first that it was his body that was taken up. It didn't say the Lord sent and caught up his spirit or his soul. It was his body that was taken up, and if his body was taken up into space, it was obviously taken up in a pretty solid material type of a capsule. There wouldn't have been any point of doing it if it hadn't been. because human bodies don't fare very well in space by themselves. If you want to drag a human body through space by itself without the proper surroundings, it wouldn't be worth very much when it got to wherever it was going. It might just well have left it behind to begin with. So we look for a description of this capsule, this device. We find first that it was certainly a solid device and of some size because it displaced the air before it. It speaks repeatedly of the rush of air that accompanied the approach and departure of the craft. The whirlwind went with it when it went and came with it when it came, meaning it was displacing air very rapidly, and there was a rush of air that always accompanied it, just indicating a high rate of acceleration. We see some further description. It says it was a chariot of fire, but if you look into the Aramaic, the only word they have which describes an object which travels rapidly and carries passengers was a chariot. They had to use that word because it's the only one there was. We didn't have any word capsule or spacecraft or anything else to use. They had to use chariot because that's all it was. And the chariot of fire simply indicated that it emitted light, and these objects almost invariably do emit light when they're accelerating due to the extremely high ionization of the air created by the resonating fields about the craft. They ionize the air to a point where it emits a considerable quantity of light. But you have a little further description there. It had the face of a lion, the face of an eagle, the face of a man, and the lightning was within it. And again, this doesn't seem to mean much. You see a lot of grinning faces sticking out from that craft until you consider the Aramaic language, and you find that the word face has a number of meanings. And physiognomy is one of the smallest of the meanings of that word. We have the same thing here. It's come down through the Greek, it's still come down to us. We speak in legal terminology of prima facie evidence, first face evidence, how the thing appears, the nature and character of the thing as it appears to our sight. Prima facie evidence, first face evidence. If we apply this terminology, or this translation of the word, we find that this craft had the characteristics of a lion because it could leap rapidly from the surface of the earth. It had great strength and agility. It had the characteristics of an eagle because it could soar through the heavens, and probably referring specifically to that light soaring motion that's almost always observed. It's like hunting motion. I could explain it to you scientifically why they have those, but I don't want to get too involved. There's only so much we can do in a given night. But it had the characteristics of an eagle in the way it soared through the heavens. It had the characteristics of a man because it was intelligently controlled. Whether or not the controller was in the craft or whether it was being controlled from a distance, it was being intelligently controlled. And the lightning was within it. And in the Aramaic language, there is only one word that refers to electricity, and that is lightning, because it's the only natural manifestation of electricity there is. But if you translate that statement into technical language today, this was a solid material craft of some size with a high rate of acceleration, which displaced the air before it. It leaped rapidly from the surface of the earth. It soared through the heavens with a slight soaring motion. It was intelligently controlled and electrically propelled. And if you go into the translation of the Sefer Torah, which Dr. Lathrop Warren completed about a year ago, it had never been translated before. It's been around for at least 3,000 years. No one had ever tried to translate it. It took him 26 years. But in that translation, there are 2 full chapters of the nature of this craft, the material of which it's composed, the propulsion mechanism, the power source, which turns out to be the cold fusion of hydrogen, the means of obtaining that hydrogen by the electrolysis of water. In a text that's at least 3,000 years old, and probably a great deal older than that, and has been around ever since. It's never been translated until 26 years ago when Dr. Lathrop Warren began to translate it. And the portion he translated that referred to a cold fusion of hydrogen was translated about 15 years before we ever dreamed of doing it ourselves. We weren't talking 20 years ago. That was one of the first parts that translated, and we haven't even started to talk about fusion. We weren't talking about fusion of hydrogen and much less the cold fusion of hydrogen. So it's a remarkable document. We have very short excerpts in the Bible, but even those excerpts are enlightening if you pay enough attention to it, see what it means. The very first statement in the Bible has confused people for years. In the first of Genesis, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. This is a statement that you just can't associate with a planet. The planet will have some form, and it will not be void if it's a planet. But again, if you take this word earth and you trace it back to the word that was translated earth, you find the Aramaic word was a word which referred to an act of creation. And it refers to the creation of the galaxy rather than the creation of the earth. The description of the creation of the earth comes later. Comes in the next couple of verses. But the first statement begins with the condensation of a dark nebula into a galaxy. And a dark nebula is without form, and it is void. It's a finer vacuum. If you go into the middle of the Horse's Head Nebula in Orion, of which I have a picture on this film, there's enough interest, and enough of you want to stay around that long, I might be able to set up the projection. But this is just a tremendous mass of still very rarefied gas. It's collected in the interstices between existing galactic clusters. It's a few tens of thousands of light years across and a good deal longer than that, and it's beginning to swing into the vortex that will eventually produce a galaxy. If we had about 2 billion more years of leisure to sit around and watch it, we could watch a galaxy being formed. We'd see the stars appear in the center. We'd see the light being created and the light being divided from the darkness, and we'd see all the steps that are described in the Bible. But if before the light was formed, before the light was created, if we were in the middle of that, we'd know exactly what they meant by the thing that was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, because you'd be in absolute darkness. That mass, while it's very tenuous, is still big enough so it absorbs all the light from any of the stars around. It looks black to us. We see it because we can't see any stars behind it, because they absorb all of the light from the stars behind it. And if you were in the center of that, you'd know what it meant by without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And if you don't think a few thousand light years across is deep, why, try to hop across it sometime on 1 foot. It is the most precise description of the formation of a galaxy that would be possible to make in that many words. But it's only when we began to realize what it referred to that we realized what a good description it is. The same thing is true all through the Bible. There's so many statements of precise scientific knowledge that we are beginning to understand today because we have learned what they mean. All through the Bible we find these types of references that never seem to have too much meaning. We said, well, we accept them because they're in the Bible, but what do they mean? And now we're beginning to understand exactly what they mean. But we have many such references in biblical times to the observation. We have a statement of the craft that led the people out of bondage, and it was a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. You see a number of references in the Bible to a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. These devices, when they are in the atmosphere, and that atmosphere is at saturation or close to saturation, will always, and they're not moving too rapidly. If they're moving slowly, they will always have a cloud formation around them, because they have this tremendous field around them that ionizes the air. And air, whenever it is supersaturated, will condense instantly around any ionized body. The Wilson cloud chamber, the first device that we had for studying nuclear physics, operated because a high-energy particle coming through it knocked off electrons from the atoms as it went by and ionized those atoms. And the Wilson cloud chamber is just a glass chamber in which you can reduce the air pressure suddenly with a bellows, and you have air in there that is saturated with moisture. When you suddenly pull the bellows out, it becomes supersaturated, but there's a moment before natural condensation begins. And if in that moment any high-energy particle comes through there and knocks electrons off the particles as it goes, it will ionize the atoms. This vapor will immediately condense, and it'll make a little streak of vapor right through the chamber that is tens of thousands of times wider than the particle which made it and can be photographed. So we know from this how fast condensation takes place around an ionized body, and the air in the vicinity of these things is always ionized. So if they're moving rapidly, they're leaving this behind so fast that there wouldn't be much but a contrail behind them. But if they're moving slowly, they will quite frequently be enveloped in cloud if the air is at or near saturation. And because at night, this ionization, the air is ionized to a sufficient degree that it does give off photons, it does give off light. You see it as a light at night, and you see it as a cloud by day. So it is, again, we have a very precise description of something that is predictable. Without having seen that description, you could say, well, if there is a craft, if it produces a field by a G field by resonating electrical and magnetic fields, this is what would happen. And you look and you see it happening. I didn't mean to get into a scientific lecture here. That was a long answer to one question. Do we have any other questions? In any of these descriptions, I know perfectly well I'm answering some questions as I go along anyhow. Yeah.
Well, of course, I think everyone would be interested in your personal experience because it isn't often that anyone who has been in a flying saucer visits Paris. But you don't feel that you could discuss that?
Well, I have already discussed most of the essential factors of it. I said when it happened, where it happened, how I happened to be there.
Is there any similarity between your analogy of the people in the jungle before the bow and arrow stage and the lake that was going to come down?
Well, this, yes, this is an important thing. What happened to me at White Sands Proving Grounds on the evening of the 4th of July in the year 1950 was probably the most important thing that ever happened to me in my life, or ever will happen to me in my life. But it's of relatively little significance to anyone else, except to point out that the same thing could happen to anyone, except to bring forth the fact that we are in the midst of a whole galaxy of life, and that if we open our eyes, we're going to see it. Just as the ant, if it ever really opened its eyes, would see the number of types of life around it, though it probably never has. It is improbable that any ant on this planet has ever become aware of the existence of any human being, despite the fact that the two of them have occupied the same planet for thousands of years. We could say, well, this is because of the discrepancy in size, but it isn't. Wouldn't only be that. It would be primarily due to the fact that the ant, of course, is the highest degree of advancement and civilization on this planet. I mean, this is a fact that's obvious to the ant, at least. We may or may not accept it, but the ant certainly accepts it. They're the supreme product of the universe. And it's unlikely that any ant has ever become aware of the existence of any human. Now, our entomologists, when they want to study the life pattern of an ant, they will find first an anthill, a natural anthill. It looks real prosperous and growing and about ready to divide up. And anthills do, or ant colonies divide just as bee colonies do from time to time. They go off, and a certain portion of them will go off and start a new hill. So the entomologist, if he's got the time and a little patience, you can dig up this anthill and just dump the whole thing in a big glass jar and hope that they will get enough organization together to restore their dwelling in this jar. But it never works out so well that way, although you do find these little ant colonies on sale in the stores. But they do about the same thing, except they bury the entire jar in the ground about 20 feet from an existing anthill. They fill it with dirt and smooth the dirt over it, and they, right on top of this wide-mouthed jar, they'll begin to put food, whatever food that particular variety of ant most desired. Well, of course, they'll soon discover that food. They'll soon learn that it's constantly replaced. There's a constant supply of food available at that point. And about 3 times out of 4, at least, when a new colony is started, it'll be started right on that point where the supply of food is available, which is on top of the jar, so that the colony builds down and, of course, builds its nest inside the jar. It doesn't realize it because the whole thing is buried in the ground. But as their tunnels go on, eventually they come up against the glass, and being unable to penetrate the glass, the tunnels will then follow the walls of the glass, so that the glass is one side of the tunnel. I think probably most of you have seen these ant colonies, and you can see the little burrows going along the side of the glass. Well, the entomologist will come out one day when his ant colony is well established, and he'll pull up the jar and take it into his laboratory and bring up his cameras and his lights and so forth and begin to photograph the life history of the ant. You see some interesting things. You see, for instance, that every ant egg is rotated 180 degrees every day. Every one of those eggs is turned half over every day. Every 24 hours they're rotated half a turn. You can photograph those things. You can study them in the most intimate detail. But if any one of those ants suggested to his fellows that they were under observation by its superior intelligence, he would probably be considered a little bit cracked. And if he were to go even farther and suggest that perhaps their entire environment had been specifically arranged in order to make that observation easy, he would then probably be confined in whatever place of confinement ants have for such cases, because he would then have reached a hopeless state. If the entomologist were to place a tongs or a forceps or something suddenly down near the entrance to the hole, quite a number of ants would see that appear. They would know that it hadn't been there before. And they would have a problem explaining how that thing suddenly appeared, because obviously too big to be carried by any number of ants. They would eventually come up with some type of earthly explanation. That is, they'd eventually come up with some type of explanation that didn't require the existence of a superior race. It might be quite a job, but they'd eventually do it. They'd escape from the realization that a superior race was observing them if they possibly could. There might be a few of the ants who are progressed far enough to accept the fact with equanimity that there might be such superior races, but the majority of the ants could never do it. Oh, I'm getting far afield on these answers, but I think maybe I answer a couple of the 10,000 questions with each dissertation. But in the, I began to refer to the lake, the problem. During the period that this sampling device was on the ground, on the earth, near White Sands Proving Ground, I was able to communicate through this intercom. And I was able to ask some questions, and to every question I asked, I got a complete, a logical, and in almost every case, an understandable answer. Where the answer was not understandable to me, it was because it referred to a state of the art that we haven't reached yet. That is a point that couldn't be explained any more than our pilot landing in the midst of this tribe of bushmen who haven't achieved the bow and arrow could ever explain to them the laws of aerodynamics and thermodynamics that permit that jet craft to operate. He could never do it. It wouldn't matter how intelligent those natives were. The words and the concepts necessary to explain don't yet exist in their language. He could try a few analogies and perhaps give them a vague idea. But at any rate, there was a reference to the fact that this race was, or had become interested in us, because they had realized that we were at that critical point in our development. And that this is nothing unique in the universe. This is a point that comes sooner or later to every race, anywhere in the universe. Every race that is born to intelligence or achieves intelligence, achieves any development, reaches sooner or later this critical problem. And it's a critical problem on which the future of that race absolutely depends. If they solve the problem, they go on, and they're never in danger again. If they don't, they inevitably go back and start from the beginning. And he pointed out that critical problem now existed in this race. And I said, oh, you mean the fact that we have developed nuclear weapons? And the reply was no. That the nuclear weapons were a symptom of the problem, that's all. That if they didn't exist, there would be some other symptom or symptoms of the problem that did exist. But they were not the problem themselves. And I said, would it be possible to explain that problem in such a manner that I could understand it? Remembering that I have had no training in theology, I have no training in theosophy, I have never studied economics especially. I have since that time, but at that time I had never gone into these fields at all. I knew chemistry, physics, electronics, I knew the sciences, and that's about all. I had reached a point where I'd lost sight of the fact that there was anything else that was important. So I said, if you can understand it, if you can explain it so that I can understand it, then certainly anybody else on this planet should be able to. The reply was, yes, it could readily be explained so that even I could understand it. And the explanation was this, that there were three major branches into which science as a whole can be divided. Now I pause a minute to give you the definition of science so that you'll know what I mean. We have come to take a very restricted view of science, or it brings a little narrow segment to our mind. In Noah Webster's first unabridged dictionary of the English language, which he issued first in 1827, the term science is defined as the orderly and intelligently directed search for truth. And that's the only definition that's given. The orderly and intelligently directed search for truth. And any search for truth that is orderly and is intelligently directed is science, and it doesn't make a particular difference in what direction you go. If you are searching for truth in science of extrasensory perception or hypnotism or flying saucers or anything else, if that search is orderly and intelligently directed, you are a scientist. You are pursuing science. But with that definition, science can be divided into three general categories. You can't draw the lines sharply because they overlap, and the laws common to one are common to all. But you can divide them for the purpose of discussion and understanding, and we divide them into, first, the physical or material science, which deals with the needs and desires of the body and the physical universe in which that body dwells. The second is known as the social science, and it deals with the relationship that exists between man and his fellow man. And lastly, the spiritual science that deals with the relationship that exists between man and those powers which are above the normal plane of man's existence, which we do not yet completely understand, but which we usually describe as God. All of the science in the universe will come under one of those three heads. And all branches, all those three branches must be developed simultaneously if there is to be any success in any civilization anywhere in the universe. They must be simultaneously developed. There can be no very appreciable lag between any one of them. Now this, and also that the social and spiritual sciences must come first. That there can be no development of any material science until there first exists a foundation of social and spiritual science. This is something that we can even easily prove to ourselves if we consider the difference between man and the animal. Now, I've heard people say, well, there isn't any difference. Man is just an animal that's achieved a little higher degree of intelligence, and so he's developed a material science. But there are a number of specific differences between any man and any animal, and this is one of them. The animal has no social or spiritual science and has never developed a material science and never will. He doesn't have the foundation. A few of the insects that we spoke of, the ant and the bee, we call them social insects because they have developed a very rudimentary form of social science. They live together in large numbers, they work for a common purpose, and they have a form of discipline that's common to all. And as a result, they have developed a very limited material science in that they do erect simple structures and they store food against a future time of need. The fact that they have no spiritual science has proven an absolute bar to any further development. The ant and the bee have not advanced a single step in thousands of years, and they never will. They don't have the foundation. They can never go any farther. Mankind, on the other hand, has from the very beginning of his development realized one cardinal fact, that there is a supreme power and intelligence that pervades and controls all nature. And every man that has ever lived has realized it. There are no true atheists among mankind. There are many who proclaim atheism, and I've known some of them. I've known quite a few under various conditions. The man who proclaims atheism is a man who is in revolt against some particular concept of that power or that deity. And in his revolt, he goes all the way and he tries to dismiss the whole thing, which his conscience, his instinct, and his inner being knows is not true, and which is very frequently proven to him that he knows it's not true. In my early youth, I worked in construction trades, and it was at a time when this work was done at a very fast pace. Very few safety factors could be used. We lost a lot of men. There wasn't a construction job we ever went into that men weren't killed during the job. I had the sad task on several occasions of scraping up the remnants of some of my best friends that had made a mistake at a critical moment. And I myself was in positions a number of times when it looked like there wasn't any reasonable probability of survival beyond the next few seconds. On one of these occasions, I was in the immediate company of two men who had professed atheism loudly and longly, and with great vigor and verve and sometimes sarcasm and so forth. The three of us were together, and we suddenly found ourselves in a situation from which it seemed that there was no escape and that the end was only seconds away. Neither one of these men lost 1 minute, lost 1 second in calling upon the deity. And no matter how loudly they might have denied him outwardly, in the conscience they knew it was there. I mean, the instant it looked like that last minute had come, they both called him. And they never said anything about atheism again in their life, because they were convinced. So there are no true atheists. Every man that has ever lived has realized that one cardinal fact. We can go back into these tribes we talked about that haven't yet developed the bow and arrow, the very simplest form of intelligent life on this planet. We find they're very precise forms of religious observance. We may think, well, they're completely mistaken how oddly they approach this thing, but they realize that that power exists, and they have a demand, a need to know more about the nature of that power. And so the spiritual science is the very first science that develops. It comes about in the very dawn of human intelligence before anything else at all, with the realization that man can improve the conditions of his daily life only through cooperation. Come the first tribal gatherings that represent the beginning of the social science. And so then we have the foundation, the two elements of the foundation. And from that foundation, the material science emerges as a superstructure, standing upon and supported by this foundation. And it's right at that point where the problem begins. The problem sooner or later brings critical hazard to the development of every civilization. Because this material science, being constantly stimulated by the ever-increasing needs and desires of the body, progresses normally according to the square of time. It's not a linear factor. We were just talking about the tremendous acceleration in our scientific advance. We've advanced farther in 30 years than we did in the previous 100, and farther in that 100 than we did in the previous 1,000. This material science constantly accelerates its advance. The social and spiritual sciences, on the other hand, develop normally only directly with time. And even this rate of progress is not always maintained. So we now have the problem of a tremendous, massive, towering superstructure growing at an ever-increasing rate, standing upon and supported only by a foundation that's growing at a much smaller rate. Unless some means can be found to stimulate the growth of that foundation, a time will inevitably come when the foundation can no longer support it. and it will collapse upon that foundation, bringing ruin and destruction to both. It has happened before on this planet, and the time has arrived when it could well happen again. We see the evidences of it. We see the tottering of the structure. We are now in constant danger of total annihilation by an agency which we ourselves have created. We ourselves created this thing that now threatens to destroy all civilization on this planet. Why should a man be threatened by his own creations? We have not progressed far enough in the social and spiritual science and the foundation sciences to enable us to control those things which we create in the material science. There's nothing wrong with material science. Many people blame material science. There's nothing wrong with it, but if you begin to build a skyscraper on a foundation intended for a 2-story building, somewhere along in the construction, the thing is going to collapse. There isn't anything basically wrong with either the superstructure or the foundation. One just isn't big enough to support the other. And the answer is also very clear and very plain. If you were building a large building and you suddenly discovered that owing to a miscalculation, the foundation wasn't going to be strong enough to support the building, would you immediately begin to tear the building down? Or would you just stand around twiddling your thumbs and hoping for the best until it did collapse? Not if you're an intelligent builder. You'd immediately begin to seek for means to enlarge and strengthen the foundation. And it would be something that would be easy to do. If we consider statistically our position today, and there are statistics available on man-hours devoted to every conceivable purpose, we find that about 80% of all the man-hours expended for all purposes in this country are devoted to the material science, and about the same in all civilized countries. About 80% are devoted to the material science. The remaining 20% are divided about equally between the social and spiritual sciences. They get about 10% apiece. But it just isn't enough to create a foundation for the superstructure that the 80% builds. The ratio has to be corrected a little bit. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to give up anything we have. We don't have to give up our village to climb the walls of this canyon a little bit. It does mean we have to apply a little additional effort. And you people are all aware of it, or you wouldn't be here tonight. People who aren't aware of it are the people who are sitting with their feet up on a chair and a can of beer and watching television. And letting other people tell them what they should think, how they should feel, what they should buy, what entertainment they should go to, and everything that they do. There are some people today who are told every act that they should do from beginning to end. And if you are willing to be led, there's always someone willing to lead you in whatever direction they want to lead you. But if the world could see today the problem and the simplicity of the solution would begin to be reached almost immediately. During the last Great War, when we found ourselves threatened with destruction as a nation because we were at war, I was working in defense industry at the time up at Caltech's Eaton Canyon rocket project, and we had all kinds of men come in there. We had bankers, bank president. We had a bank president who was working out in the test bays, cleaning up the cords and the steel tubes and so forth in which the test shots were fired, doing manual labor out there in the test bays for 8 hours every night on swing shift. He was a bank president all day long. But he knew that we were at war. He knew that this country was in a hazardous position, and he says, I can spare a little bit of extra effort. I want to do that. I want to put that effort in where it will solve this problem or where it will release us from this danger. And so I'm going to come down here and take a spare time job. Well, we had hundreds of them, literally. People in sedentary occupations all felt, well, they could spare a little bit more effort. They didn't give up any of the jobs they had. They just put in a little spare time. And if we could get this picture over to the world of the size of the foundation, the size of the superstructure, and that we've got to get a little more effort devoted to the foundation, we'd have a lot of spare-time workers, especially if they realize that the continued existence of this civilization is going to depend on it. It isn't only a nation that has it, it's the entire civilization that's at hazard. And that the problem is simple if you understand it, that you've got to have a foundation big enough to support the building that you're going to build on. And you can get it as soon as you begin to devote that same percentage of effort to it. There are no insoluble problems in this world. When we found ourselves at war, as I was speaking about a minute ago, we said we have got to have the most tremendous weapon ever achieved by man. We got to have something so tremendous that no nation will ever dare challenge us again. Well, this was poor psychology as far as thinking that no nation ever challenge us if we had any weapon, but we used the proven method to get that weapon. We called together all of the greatest intelligence in the world on that subject. We got Fermi from Italy, we got 2 men from Japan, we got several from Germany before the doors closed there. We gathered up our own experts, we got them all together in one place and said, here you are, you're the greatest experts on nuclear physics in the world. Here is unlimited money, here is unlimited tools, here are unlimited buildings. Anything that you can ask for, we will give you. Now build us nuclear weapons. And in 2 years it was done. In 2 years, this thing that was beyond the concept of the average man was completed. And had killed 80,000 people in Hiroshima in its first test. But if we use that same amount of determination, that same full-scale, all-out effort, that same collection of the greatest minds on the subject, the same unstinted expenditure of money, we could solve any problem that we have. There are no insoluble problems. There are only problems to which we haven't devoted enough time, enough energy, and enough determination. We say today that our danger stems primarily, and it does, from the controversy between the free world and the communist world. We say that the communist government originated through force, and it did, and that it continues to grow and expand by force, and it does, and that it understands and respects only force, and it's apparent that it does. And we say that therefore the only way in which we can protect ourselves against the threat to our way of life which it offers is through the use or the threat of the use of force. And unfortunately, under present circumstances, this may well be true. But it is a sad commentary on the state of development of our social sciences or our spiritual sciences when we are forced to admit that we have no means, we have no successful means by which we can cope with brute force except through the use or the threat of the use of brute force. It's a very sad commentary. If we had devoted 1/2 as much effort to the social science as we have to the material science, we would have solved these problems a long time ago. They would never come up. If they did come up, we'd know how to cope with them without the use of the threat of the use of force, but we've just never used that effort. We say if we can build a big enough bomb and we can build good enough means of delivery, we can scare our enemies into becoming our friends. And unfortunately, it just hasn't worked. It's never worked in history. Been tried again and again, and it's always failed. Nobody can ever build a big enough bomb to scare his enemy into becoming his friend. And yet we are gambling the whole continued existence of this civilization on the hope that we can do it this time, in spite of all the obvious failures in the past. There is another explanation of this. I'm aware of all the arguments that are made pro and con, and usually we say, well, we're just building the big bombs, we're just buying time. And it may well be true, we're buying time. But what are we doing with the time that we buy? Almost the entire effort we're using to build still bigger bombs, to buy more time. You could build the biggest bomb in the universe and the best method of delivery in the universe, and you wouldn't solve a single problem in social science. You cannot overcome your derelictions in one branch of the science by an appeal to the other. You got to meet the problems in each division of that science. You can't overcome them. You can't ignore them. You can't override the problems in the social science by any appeal whatever to the material science. It just doesn't work. So we keep thinking that we can. So we keep trying, and that's one of our biggest problems. Anyway, this is where the lake is. This is the problem. This is the solution, and it's as simple as ABC, that if we could get the ratio of effort changed. There isn't any magic formula. I can't tell you what we need to do to advance the spiritual science today. We have to find out, but the only way we're going to find out is to start working at it and start thinking about it. And I'm not preaching to you folks here because you realize the situation consciously or unconsciously, or you wouldn't be here tonight. But when we think of the hundreds of millions that don't, that in general don't think of anything. They go to work in the morning and all they're thinking of is when they can get off in the evening, how soon they can get home and get their feet up on the chair and a can of beer opened and get the television going. And there are so many people that this is as far as their life goes. Well, these people are completely controlled by anyone who has access to the means of dissemination of news. Controls those people just as surely as any person does a flock of sheep. Because the only opinions they have are the opinions that they are given over those means of communication. The only thoughts they have are the ones that are put into their head. The only knowledge they have is the knowledge that's specifically given to them to that medium. So they're complete sheep to whoever is controlling that medium of expression. And they have very few thoughts outside of that. Of course, the only solution to this, if we're going to reach these people, we have to reach them through television. We have to reach them through radio, through television. Understanding is building their own radio broadcasting station in Martin. We will be on the air the first of the year. We're probably not in this station yet, but we'll be on the air the first of the year. We will be attempting to get into some of the fields by which people can be reached who won't stir out of their chairs at night except to listen to the radio or watch television. It's possible to reach the people this way, and there are some who can't possibly be reached any other way. But Understanding has 64 clubs. There's a few thousand people involved. It is 0.1% of the minimum group needed to bring real realization to the world of the simplicity of the problems. You can reduce them to ABCs of simplicity. And when you do, you can see that they're true. You can then build them up. You can then apply them to each individual problem as you see it. As you come to those problems, you can apply and you can see that that problem really stems from this very simple situation. And you can see that if an equal amount of effort today were placed on the social science, if the same percentage of effort were devoted to the social science as devoted to the material science, we'd begin to have answers real quickly. The only problem is I'm here tonight. That's the principal reason I go anywhere. It certainly isn't to make a living. And if I had to make my living lecturing, I assure you I would have starved to death a long time ago. And I would have to walk because I would never be able to buy the gasoline between the different stops that I make. But I do design instruments. I'm a design engineer. I personally designed 3 of the control instruments that have been on every Atlas missile that has ever left the ground. I designed them personally. And having designed them, I know what those missiles will do if they ever have to be used. I have a very graphic mental picture, which most people's minds just refuse to grasp at all. And perhaps it's just as well that they do. I also have several children. I'd like to have some kind of a world for them to live in. And that's why I'm spending my own money, my own time, my own effort, taking a spare time job. And it has to be a spare time job. I can't make it a full-time job yet because I can't make a living in it. But it is a spare time job to which I devote just as much time, just as much energy as I possibly can. And the problems are very simple. I try to reduce them to extreme simplicity so they can be understood by anyone. I didn't mean to make a sermon on this, but this is the lake, and I wanted to get over as plain as I could. Do we have any other quick questions? I don't have any idea what time it is. Well, I do too. It's, no, I don't. I didn't wind this thing tonight. Maybe it's just a... Pardon? 7:11. Well, my time is yours. I mean, I'll stay just as long as you folks want, or just as long as you can stay up here.
We have coffee ready. Suppose we have some coffee, and those who want to stay and talk some more can stay and talk.
Okay.
Do you think the groups like us are doing good on that?
We answered that earlier in the evening. There is no effort for good that's ever lost. A small group does some good. A bigger group does a little more. If you have a dozen groups, they'll do a dozen times as much, and eventually it reaches a point where it turns the tide. There are a tremendous number of these small groups, and they are being reached one after another by, I think, people who realize the simple problems. You have people come and talk and point out the problems and so forth, and there are a surprising number of people who realize the problem, have come to realize the problem, just as there are a surprising number of people who realize the existence of extraterrestrial life and intelligence. You can go through a city and you can walk with these people and talk with them for a year and never realize that they have any interest until someone else starts the discussion. A friend of mine named Stan Van Sickle and I have performed an experiment quite a number of times in Los Angeles at various times through the years to see how the ratio changes. But the two of us will simply get on a crowded bus in downtown Los Angeles during rush hour. The bus will be full, everyone's standing up, or the seats are full, but I mean a lot of people standing, and they're all sort of crowded together. He or I will begin to discuss some unidentified object that we saw in the sky, just to each other, paying no attention to the people around us at all. We'll begin to discuss it. In about 30 seconds, this man standing here, his ear will come up and he'll turn and say, do you think there could really be anything to that? Why, 6 months ago, my wife and I were standing on the back porch and we saw an object, and he'll begin to describe the object he saw. About 30 seconds after that, the man on the other side will turn and he'll say, well, now that you mention it, Joe Spivas and I were out hunting last year, and while we were out there, we saw one of these things go overhead, and he'll begin to describe what he saw. In 5 minutes, you got that whole busload of people talking about what they saw. But they all wind up the same way. They all say the same thing in the end, but, well, we saw it, and we know what we saw, but we wouldn't say anything to anyone else because everybody else would think we were crazy. So you see, you could have the most ridiculous situation. Eventually, we'll have a situation where everybody in the United States will have seen one. And they'll still all be afraid to say anything for fear everybody else will think they're crazy. Yes.
Why would you say the government minimizes information about space and
This is a question that has to be divided into components to be answered. That's one of the reasons it's always asked. There are a number of these big basic questions that are tremendous oversimplifications of the problem, and in giving a simple answer to it, the answer will never be right. You have to divide it into the series of problems that it actually is. In the first place, what do we mean when we say the government? Now, we sort of unconsciously think of an old man with a long white beard and a red, white, and blue stovepipe hat. I mean, we're thinking of Uncle Sam. The government actually is not a single individual. It isn't even a reasonably coordinated group of individuals. It consists literally of thousands of individuals, each one of whom is a human being, each one of whom has his own idea and his own beliefs just as we. None of them have absolute, complete knowledge of anything. No one does, as a matter of fact. We all achieve degrees of evidence satisfactory to us, and we say, well, I accept this fact because it's been proven. I mean, I have seen an amount of evidence that brings conviction to me. But there are basic, in government, if we have to use that word, in government, there are three basic groups. I've talked to many members in government. I'll be in Washington, D.C. day after tomorrow, and I'll be talking to some, just as I always have. I'll be giving 3 lectures there. There's always a few senators, always a few representatives around. We always yak a little bit afterwards. And there are 3 basic divisions of opinion on the subject. The government as a whole. One of these divisions is convinced that a certain percentage of these reports are real, are material, are extraterrestrial machines, and the people should be told. There's another group of about equal size that also believes that a certain percentage of these are real, material, extraterrestrial, or guided by intelligence, and the people should not be told because it's much too dangerous. Then there's a third group whose ego is still in the ascendant, who says, well, don't bother me with that, I don't believe a bit of it. And I'm not even going to look at the evidence because I might believe if I looked at the evidence. Yeah. Well, naturally, they don't want to, they think it would be very dangerous to make a statement. So, in general, we have 2 to 1 in the government that believe a certain percentage of them are real. But we always also have 2 to 1 that believe the people shouldn't be told. This habit of governmental secrecy, of course, gets worse all the time. And essentially, the government doesn't tell anyone anything now unless it's something that they absolutely have to have. This is a serious thing as far as our government, because this is the military concept. This shows how completely our government is actually controlled by military thinking today. In a democracy, we have the principle of the right to know. We say the people are actually the government. We appoint certain representatives to express our opinion for us, that they are supposed to be expressing our opinion. How can they express our opinion if we don't know the problems? How can we make a decision or know what the opinion should be if we don't know the problems on which the answers have to be found? So there is, if a democracy is to be successful, there has to be a principle of the right to know, the right of the people to know everything. In a military government, there is the principle of the need to know, and that also is necessary from a military standpoint. If you are going to start a large-scale advance or onslaught on the enemy, a very necessary factor in the success of that program is the ignorance of the enemy. And the only way to assure the ignorance of the enemy is to keep as many of the facts secret as possible. I mean, the private is never told anything except when to start marching forward and when to stop. As you go up the chain of command, the officers are never told any more than is absolutely necessary for them satisfactorily to perform the function which is allotted to them. As you go farther up the chain of command, you have to tell them a little more and a little more and a little more because their responsibilities are wider. But you never tell anyone anything that he doesn't need to know. It's the concept of the need to know. And it has been brought into all government contracts, all government work. It's the statement has become a statement, is there a need to know? I mean, never tell your pal, even if he's working on the next bench you, don't tell him anything unless it's something that he needs to know. Never give out any information to anyone unless that person needs it in order to perform the function that he's doing. So this has become a concept of information in government. Everything is considered on the basis, well, does the public really need to know this, or does John Smith really need to know this? If not, why bother telling him? But it's the military concept, and the degree to which it's taken over in government is a serious thing because it shows how close we're approaching to a completely military government.
How do we get this objection across?
You should be having some refreshment too.
Oh, I have objected a little bit. I had an editorial on the subject entitled "The Right to Know," and then I have some here. I think it needs to be
Needs warming.
I think it needs to be warmed up a little bit.
A fresh cup.
No, fresh.
Scanning your radio. I have
Say that there is any communication.
I think probably that is the most common, most common means. It's a means that is possessed by every person on I think it's a means that's possessed by every person on this planet to a greater or lesser extent. Well, it's, yeah. Oh, it's very good. I like it either black or termite. Yeah, that's it.
You're the best books to get a clinic. Bill?
Oh,
This is this is a question, the definition of authentic. If I were to give a strict answer to that, I can say, well, there's only one that I know is authentic, and that's my own, because I know it's authentic. There's some others that I believe are, but it wasn't there. So, I think that, George Van Tassel's Into This World and Out Again is a very interesting one. I don't know how authentic it is. I think that there's a great deal of understanding in it. And I'm quite sure that Van had the contact that he speaks of. Of course, he's written several books. Into This World and Out Again is just one of them. And it's a little startling to the person who reads it the first time, but it's also very interesting. I don't know whether any of you here have read it or not.
I read these about women.
Yeah. So, he's the one who has the saucer convention every year. That has for 12 years. They have anywhere from 4,000 to 12,000 people a year at that convention. They come from all over the United States and try all over this place. And they just flew into Germany again. This last convention. It's only a 2-day convention. They started playing football in central Germany was in that convention. There's all in Mexico and Canada. It's in well, it's at Giant Rock, California, which is in Southern California, near 29 Palms, if you happen to know where that is. It's not too far from Palm Springs, it's south and east of San Bernardino.
Would you say that Russia has representation there?
Pardon?
Would you say that Russia has representation there?
Well, I wouldn't be at all surprised. Russia has representation everywhere. There's anything that goes on anywhere. They don't have at least one observer president.
I'm sorry, what did you say was here south of San Bernardino?
Well, it's across the Indio Highway from Palm Springs. I mean, you go east instead of west toward Palm Springs. You go east at about that same point, but it's near 29 Palms, which is
What is this thing?
it's a Giant Rock annual spacecraft convention. It's been held for 12 years. It's been in every newspaper and a lot of the magazines. Life magazine had a big one year with they devoted 4 or 5 pages to it. It was mostly they injected quite a little sarcasm. They took the very poorest pictures. I mean, the idea was to play it down. The reporter who came out to the convention admitted it. Yet he was instructed to get only the silliest looking pictures he could. They took a lot of pictures, and some of them were very good. Some of our members got the big, quite large set. You can buy them from them. A picture that Life magazine doesn't use, you can get 8 by 10 copies of them for $3. They don't use it in the magazine. And we got a big batch of these pictures that were taken at the convention. Some real beautiful pictures. They didn't use any of them. The ones they used were the ones that, and which people were looking a little bit silly, you know. And Van Tassel, to illustrate what I mean, Van Tassel had the chaplet. And when you have that particular year, when you have a chaplet, but every once in a while you kind of sort of like that. Yeah, and that reporter, that photographer, followed Van for hours, and I bet snapped 100 pictures before he got one with his camera. No, this is the one they promised me. That's one they used. But he took 100 pictures before he got one just at the right second.
To get back to the ESP communication between the inhabitants of outer space and Earth is, you said that it's your feeling that there is.
Well, I think it's one of the commonest forms because it's a form of communication that everyone possesses. The present Earth civilization has got away from it a lot because it's not a very private means. With our increasing complexity of our life, we have to have more and more personal privacy. And so we sheer away from something that might be picked up. We don't like to broadcast. Consciously, unconsciously, we sheer away from ESP because it might be picked up by almost anyone. It isn't easily enough directed. You can go into the hallway or the closet and you can talk with some person. You can be pretty sure that only one person is going to hear it. But if you use ESP, you can't be sure. Now, animals use it to a much greater degree than human beings do. And most insects use it entirely. It's the only means of communication they have. This was the fact that aroused Dr. J.B. Ryan's interest to begin with. According to history, in ESP, way back years and years ago, they began to study the habits of the fruit moth, and they were surprised by the fact that the fruit moth could apparently attract its mate from considerable distances. No matter where you took it, you could put it in a jar and you could carry it around any place a mile away suddenly or a mile in this direction, and the mate would come right along and find it almost immediately. And they thought first it must be some kind of a sound that the moth made, and it wasn't in the audible range, so they got real sensitive microphones that would respond to a much higher frequency than audible frequency. They tried everything to pick up this sound, and finally they put the moth in a sealed jar of air and put the jar in a bell jar and evacuated the air from around it so that no sound could cross that vacuum. And they found that even in these circumstances, the moth could attract its mate just as readily as it. So they knew it wasn't sound that was involved. They tried all kinds of pickups to see if there was any electromagnetic radiation. They never found electromagnetic radiation. Anyhow, it was this search for the means by which the moth was attracting its mate, no matter where it was or under what conditions, that led into the consideration of ESP and human being. But the insects, many insects have no other means of communication. Some of them do make noises, but there are a lot of them that don't make any. And they communicate only that way. If you drop a drop of syrup in front of a lone ant out there that's miles in his scale, miles from the next nearest ant, you'd be surprised how soon there'll be a line of marching ants coming right up to that syrup. And they'll start coming long before this ant ever gets back to you.
But that's an interesting point. I never thought of that. That's true.
Well, you'll notice how fast ants get to a picnic. Sometimes when you spread that cloth out, they get to the picnic just as fast as you do.
Well,
It only takes one of them. The first ant that finds it, the rest of them all become aware of whatever that ant has found. And you can see the little feelers waving around. He'll go up and he'll sample. I've studied this many times. I've had a little eyedropper with little drops of syrup, and you see ants going around at random. You pick one that's quite a ways from you, and you drop it. Just takes a little eyedropper and drop a little drop of syrup, and he'll come up to it pretty soon and see it. And he'll sample it first. He'll sample it, and then he'll walk back like this and look around his little feelers and wave around for a few seconds. And then he'll go back and he'll start getting a gob of it to take home. Apparently, they satisfy their own hunger first. I mean, they'll take a few seconds. It looks like they're eating and they're consuming some of it, and then he'll get as much as he can carry on his mandibles, and he'll go around. He'll start back. But before he meets these other ants, they're all coming to that drop of syrup before he meets the first one that's coming. So they have this, and they use it almost exclusively. Apparently, they don't need quite as much privacy as we do. They don't have quite the individuality we do, so they use it entirely. We have gotten away from using it, but it's something that anyone has, and anyone can, if they want to spend the effort to develop it to a very competent state. There are groups in Tibet who will teach it to anybody. You don't have to be anyone particular. You do have to spend about 4 years. And you can't do one single other thing except to learn that ability during that time. There aren't very many people willing to pay the price. This is the only reason that there are more people using complete ESP. But those people go any place in the world, they see what's going on, they know what's going on, and they come back, and there isn't a television antenna anywhere at monastery. There isn't a wire of any kind comes up there. There isn't a radio receiver or anything else, but they know what's going on all over the world.
Well, some
You
people
go and see.
that go and see naturally.
Well, they all have it naturally. Some people have a little more experience in using it or use it a little more, don't repress it. It depends a lot on the background. Now, my youngest daughter had this ability to a degree that was, would be astounding to a person who wasn't accustomed to it. She was practically our only means of contact with our son when he was in the Navy. He spent 4 years in the Navy and he wrote 4 letters. I mean, he wrote once a year, whether he had anything to write about or not. We figured that was often enough. But we got curious a little bit oftener than that, and his little sister would go and see him and tell us what he was doing. And I mean, it was precise. It wasn't any generalities. He'd tell me what he was. Well, the first time, as an example, first time we became aware of this, he had been going to UCLA college, and he got the idea that the Army was breathing on his neck and that he was going to be drafted for the funeral. I don't think he would have, because he was in college. They were taking some college boys in, but anyhow, he wanted to get in the Navy. And he insisted that we give him permission before he got drafted, so he could, if he got drafted, they'd stick him in the Army. He wouldn't have any choice. If he enlisted, and of course, a lot of young fellows want to do this. So they